Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Today with Spiritual Life. My name is Jennifer Allred, and I am honored to be one of your chaplains here and one of your priests, and spending a little time with you today around a spiritual topic or practice or idea that I hope will be helpful to you during these perilous times. So, we know in spiritual life that really, and frankly, if we live long enough, that we will have challenges in life and that life can be hard. But we also are keenly aware that these are particularly difficult times and that the kind of normal stressors of life for many of us are amplified and are a little bit um, more demanding than usual right now. And so we just want to remind you that we're here to support you in any way that we can, and that doesn't depend on what you believe or who you are. We are available to anyone of any faith or no faith at all at any time. So, what I have brought today is, well, first let me say this week, this past Sunday, marks the annual feast of St. Francis. And most of us, if you have any familiarity with the saints, most of us kind of grew up knowing about St. Francis as the patron saint of the animals. People have his statue sometimes in their gardens at home. Um, and he's also been declared in more recent years by the church the patron saint of ecology. And as we've become more aware of our environmental trespasses and our kind of great need to become more spiritually aware of what the meaning of climate change in our lives and to the life of the planet and to the lives of our descendants, then that has become an even more important and pressing issue. So, even if you're not Catholic, you may enjoy the idea of having a saint or a figure that you can go to with certain kinds of concerns. And that's what Francis is known for, although he had a rich and complicated life, and there are many sides to his story. But among other things, during the course of his life, he founded the Order of the Franciscans, which is a monastic order that many of us know today because it is alive and well in this country and around the world. And it is really a fascinating monastic tradition and one that is governed by several principles, but one of them that came directly from Francis's life and from his religious conversions, spiritual conversions. One of them is simplicity. And I say that because then it gives me a gateway into or a transition into naming my personal favorite Franciscan hero, and that is Richard Rohr, or at least of modern times. And Richard Rohr is a Franciscan monk and has been a monk and a priest for many years. And he lives in a monastic setting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and is kind of one of the founders and stalwart um, leaders of the Center for Action and Contemplation, which is just a kind of a wonderful place that um, I think kind of accompanies people in investigating this relationship between the contemplative and the active in our lives, our spiritual lives. And he's really credited with, I think, um, I don't know, awakening a kind of movement among people who might otherwise find themselves at the margins of traditional religion or not particularly interested in modern religious or spiritual practice. And yet somehow he's managed to be attractive to a lot of people who might otherwise describe themselves as sort of, not interested. And he's done this in a number of ways, but one of them is by kind of expanding the reach and the range of his own prayer and thought and practice beyond just what is Franciscan, beyond just what is Catholic, and um, and so his most recent, well, his book before last was called The Universal Christ, and he investigates this idea that Christ is the historical figure of Jesus is also a kind of emblematic figure of the Christ, the anointed one. And then he kind of takes that and says, and this idea that Christ only sort of came into the world one time in the figure of Jesus is, I think he would say something like crazy, that it's just crazy because that the embodied God has come and is coming into the world over and over again throughout history, and that it is our job to partner with that embodiment of God and to find it in ourselves, in each other, and in our world, and never to imagine that it just was a sort of a one-time, one-off event, but that it's something that continually happens. And it happens in many forms and in many languages and in many cultures throughout history, the world over. And it's a powerful idea for people who've been turned off by modern religion by seeing it as divisive rather than unitive. And um, and so he goes after that idea in that book. And then in his most recent book, which is called The Wisdom Pattern, he makes a case that, again, throughout history and over time, we are a people in the world which belongs to God, but which is not God's, um, or is not only God's. That we are people who have experienced this pattern of order, disorder, and then reorder. In that order, he says we have to go from order to disorder in order to experience reorder, and that because we are human, we want to go from order directly to reorder and skip over all that messy disorder stuff. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And I take a lot of comfort in his thinking about this and the way he describes it, especially at a time like now, a time like these times that we live in today, where disorder feels very real and very close at hand and very frightening at times, at least for me. And and so this idea that this isn't a catastrophic end of times sort of phenomenon, but rather part of this greater ordering of human history, and that we have to trust that when we feel like we're experiencing times of disorder, that those that season or those times of reorder are just around the bend, just up ahead. So to bring a third book into this mix, Richard Rohr, my favorite heroic, my hero and favorite Franciscan, at least in the modern era, is a very prolific writer. And this book is called Breathing Underwater. And he wrote it, or well, it it started evolving 25 or 30 years ago, and it started in the form of some lectures that he gave many years ago, and then evolved into kind of a second set of lectures and evolved into a book. And the the title comes from a poem which I will share with you. He shares it in the introduction, and it's a title taken from a poem by Carol Bielek, and she is a nun, and it goes like this. It's called Breathing Underwater. I built my house by the sea, not on the sands, mind you, not on the shifting sand. And I built it of rock, a strong house by a strong sea. And we got well acquainted, the sea and I, good neighbors. Not that we spoke much. We met in silences, respectful, keeping our distance, but looking our thoughts across the fence of sand. Always the fence of sand our barrier, always the sand between. And then one day and I still don't know how it happened. The sea came, without warning, without welcome even, not sudden and swift, but a shifting across the sand like wine, less like the flow of water than the flow of blood, slow but coming, slow but flowing like an open wound. And I thought of flight, and I thought of drowning, and I thought of death. And while I thought, the sea crept higher till it reached my door. And I knew then there was neither flight, nor death, nor drowning, that when the sea comes calling, you stop being neighbors, well acquainted, friendly at a distance neighbors, and you give your house for a coral castle, and you learn to breathe underwater. And that, friends, has for me, for a long time now, been a profound poem that describes the radical giving up, the radical renegotiation of reality and self and other. And most of us don't like doing that. It's hard work and it's scary. And it usually comes at a time that we don't find very convenient. Um, and yet, it is also true, for reasons that I don't understand and can't explain, that when we are invited into those places that are frightening, into those places that require change and that require surrender on our parts, that we are also invited into spiritual growth and deep meaning. And I don't know why it can't be easier, but it would seem to be that it's just not. It's just not that way. And so this book, in that poem, introduces this book, which is about, he calls it Spirituality and the 12 Steps. And that's a reference to the 12 steps originally of Alcoholics Anonymous and of many other addictive or self-change fellowships and philosophies. But alcohol and drugs are probably the best and most well known among them, and also the oldest and the aspects of 12 step fellowships that founded the tradition. And the 12 steps were founded by a group of Christian men in the 30s in this country. And it was a pretty profound movement then as it is now. And the none other than Carl Jung, who had worked with a couple of these men and found them, in his estimation, to be beyond help, and estimated that they were on the way to more suffering and to death. And because of these steps, he described in these men what he found to be a spiritual change or a spiritual shift that allowed them to become healthy and whole and sober and to change their lives. And so the first step in the 12 steps has to do with that spiritual principle of powerlessness. And I'll just read you, because it is short, a couple, 3.5 pages about that. And Richard Rohr was not, to my knowledge, is not, to my knowledge, an addict or alcoholic, but he is just someone who's very good at looking for spiritual wisdom wherever it exists in all of its many forms. And so he got interested in the 12 steps because of its spiritual power and wisdom. And so step one of Alcoholics Anonymous is we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And many would say that you can substitute alcohol for anything that you feel is too important in your life or taking up the space that God should be taking. And then he goes on to quote Romans, the book of Romans. I cannot understand my own behavior. I fail to carry out the very things I want to do and find myself doing the very things I hate. For although the will to do good, to do what is good is in me, the performance is not. And then he quotes Matthew. And when Jesus looked at the crowds, he felt sorry for them because they were harassed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. And he says, I must be upfront with you. I do not really understand why God created the world this way. I do not know why power is its best in weakness, as Paul says. Or it is when I am weak that I am strong, 2 Corinthians. It sure seems like God is some kind of trickster. Perhaps the divine is playing games with us. God seems to have hidden holiness and wholeness in a secret place where only the humble will find it. Some topsy-turvy God has decided that those on the bottom will be revealed as the true top, and those who try for the top will find nothing of substance there. Why such a disguise? Why such a game of hide and seek? All I know is that it matches my own observation. I cannot pretend to understand God, but this is what I see. People who have moved from seeming success to seeming success seldom understand success at all, except a very limited version of their own. People who fail to do it right, even by their own definition of right, are those who often break through to enlightenment and compassion. It is still a mystery to me and will still be a mystery for you, even if you read this book to the end. The big difference, and it is big, is that you will hopefully be able to accept and even revel in this cosmic economy of grace. It is God's greatest surprise and God's constant disguise. But you only know it to be true by going through it and coming out the other side by yourself. You cannot know it by just going to church, reading scriptures, or listening to someone else talk about it, even if you agree with them. Until you bottom out and come to the limits of your own fuel supply, there is no reason for you to switch to a higher octane fuel, for that is what is happening. Why would you? You will not learn to actively draw upon a larger source until your usual resources are depleted and revealed as wanting. In fact, you will not even know there is a larger source until your own sources and resources fail you. Until and unless there is a person, situation, event, idea, conflict, or relationship that you cannot manage, you will never find the true manager. So God makes sure that several things will come your way that you cannot manage on your own. Self-made people and all heroic spiritualities will try to manufacture an even stronger self by willpower and determination to put them back in charge and seeming control. Usually, most people admire this, not realizing the unbending, sometimes proud, and even rigid personality that will be the long-term result. They will then need to continue in this pattern of self-created success and defense. This pushy response does not normally create loving people, but just people in control and in ever deeper need of control. Eventually, the game is unsustainable unless you make others, even your whole family, pay the price for your own aggression and self-assertion, which is the common pattern. More commonly, many Christians whittle down the great gospel to some moral issue over which they can feel totally triumphant and superior, and which usually asks nothing of them personally. The ego always insists on high moral ground, or as Paul brilliantly put it, sin takes advantage of commandments to mislead me, and through obeying commandments, kills me. This is a really quite extraordinary piece of insight on Paul's part, one which I would not believe myself were the disguise not so common. we see that the ego is still in charge and it just wears different disguises on both the left and the right of most groups and most issues. It is the imperial ego that has to go, and only powerlessness can do the job correctly. Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, recognized that very early in his 12-step program. Otherwise, we try to engineer our own transformation by our own rules and by our own power, which is by definition, therefore, not transformation. It seems we can in no way engineer or steer our own conversion. If we try to change our ego with the help of our ego, we only have a better disguised ego. As physicist Albert Einstein frequently said, in a different way, no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused the problem in the first place. Jesus used the metaphors of a grain of wheat or a branch cut off from the vine for this arrogant ego. Paul used the unfortunate word flesh, which made most think he was talking about the body. So some Bible translations now call it self-indulgence, which is much closer to the meaning. But both Jesus and Paul were pointing to the isolated and protected small self, and they both said it has to go. Unless the grain of wheat falls on the ground and dies, it remains only a single grain. But if it dies, it will yield a rich harvest. For Paul, the flesh or ego cannot get you where you want to go. Its concerns are too small and too selfish. An ego response is always an inadequate or even wrong response for the moment. It will not deepen or broaden life, love, or inner laughter. Your ego self is always attached to mere externals, since it has no inner substance itself. The ego itself defines itself by its attachments and revulsions. The soul does not attach, nor does it hate.